Calvin Pruitt was 49 years old, and for 14 years he had believed that the company he built was the foundation everything else rested on. The marriage, the house, the future he had sketched in his head on a yellow legal pad the night his father's funeral was over, and he had come home to an empty kitchen and sat down and decided that grief was not going to be the end of the story. He had believed that because he had built the foundation himself, concrete poured by his own design, and a man who builds a thing from scratch tends to believe in it with the stubbornness of someone who knows exactly how much it cost. Pruitt Industrial Fabrication occupied a 62,000 square foot facility on the outer edge of Decatur, Illinois. Steel framing for overhead cranes, 16 CNC machining centers, and a laser cutting operation that had been running 3 shifts a day since the second year. 41 employees, most of whom had been there long enough to know the sound the building made in the winter when the temperature differential between the shop floor and the outdoor air hit a certain range, a low metallic settling that the longtime floor hands called the building breathing. Calvin had heard it for 14 years. It sounded like the place was alive. He was sitting in the front office at 7:12 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, reviewing a purchase order for raw stock, when his production manager, a man named Breckenridge who had been on the floor since the second year, knocked on the open door and handed him a printed document without a word. It was a notice of ownership transfer, dated 4 days earlier, bearing Calvin's signature. Calvin had not signed any ownership transfer 4 days earlier. He had not signed any ownership transfer ever. He looked at the signature for 11 seconds. It was close. It was very close. But the way the loop closed on the capital P in Pruitt leaned left and Calvin's loop always leaned right, and he knew that the way he knew the sound of his own building. He set the document on the desk. He said to Breckenridge, "Thank you. Close the door on your way out." What Calvin Pruitt did in the next 30 days would leave the man who thought he had just acquired a 62,000 square foot industrial facility standing inside an empty shell, holding a deed to a building his own lawyers had already told him was worthless, while the machinery he had come to claim was 3 states away in a bonded warehouse and the legal entity he thought he owned had been formally dissolved by a bankruptcy court 6 days before he ever walked through the door. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching this from. And subscribe before you forget, because tomorrow's story picks up exactly where this kind of thing ends. Calvin's father, Douglas Pruitt, had run a small metal fabrication shop in Springfield, Illinois for 29 years, and had done it the way men of his generation ran things, by showing up before anyone else, leaving after everyone else, and never once confusing the size of an operation with the quality of it. Douglas had 12 employees at his peak, a building the size of a large garage, and a reputation in the central Illinois industrial corridor that was worth considerably more than his balance sheet suggested. He had died of a cardiac event at 63, in the parking lot of the shop, on a Tuesday morning in March, with his thermos still in his hand. Calvin had been 35. He had been working alongside his father for 7 years by then, having spent the prior 4 in a manufacturing engineering role at a larger firm in Peoria that had given him the technical vocabulary his father's shop had given him the instincts. He had handled the estate, the service, the sale of the Springfield building, and the decision about what came next in a period of about 90 days, and what came next was the legal pad list and the Decatur facility and the SBA construction loan that he had personally guaranteed with the proceeds from the Springfield sale and a second mortgage on the house he had not yet bought but went ahead and bought in order to have something to mortgage. He had moved into the house and the shop in the same month. He had lived in the shop, effectively, for the first 2 years, sleeping in the office on a cot when the second shift ran long, which was often, and eating lunch at the same gas station every day because it was on the route between the facility and the steel supplier, and the gas station made a breakfast sandwich that held through a 10-hour shift. The attendant's name was Yvonne. She had been there every morning for 14 years. She knew his order before he reached the counter. Pruitt Industrial grew because Calvin ran it the way Douglas had run the Springfield shop, except with the engineering knowledge to scale what Douglas had been doing by intuition. By year 4, they had the laser cutter. By year 6, the 4th overhead crane and the night shift expansion. By year 9, the CNC build-out that put them in conversation with aerospace subcontract work they had previously been too small to quote. The aerospace contracts changed the trajectory. They were demanding and low-margin by percentage, but the volume and the payment reliability made the overall P&L more predictable than the commercial work alone, and predictability was what let Calvin sleep on the cot without lying awake calculating. He was not a man who generated strong first impressions in a social context. He was medium height, solidly built, kept his hair short, wore steel-toed boots every day including weekends. He drove a 10-year-old GMC Sierra that he maintained himself because a man who ran a machining facility and paid someone else to change his own oil was a man whose credibility operated in one direction. He had a coffee maker in the front office that he filled from a bag of the same dark roast every morning, the same brand Douglas had kept in the Springfield shop, and he had been meaning to upgrade the coffee maker for 3 years because the carafe had developed a hairline crack that he had repaired with food-safe epoxy rather than replace. It worked fine. The epoxy held. He met Sheila at a Chamber of Commerce event in Decatur in the 3rd year of the company. She was 4 years younger than Calvin, worked in commercial banking, and had the kind of precision in conversation that he associated with people who had learned, professionally, to say only what they could document. She asked questions that were never casual. She remembered the answers. She had a habit of arriving at any meeting 7 minutes early, which Calvin had noticed because he arrived at meetings 8 minutes early, and the overlap had produced, on 2 occasions before their first actual date, a quiet interval in which they had stood in a conference room or lobby making the kind of conversation that was not small talk but also not yet anything larger. He had found her precision attractive because it mirrored his own approach and because the alternative imprecision had cost him enough in his 20s to make him careful about what he was willing to tolerate going forward. Sheila said what she meant. He had taken that as a foundational quality. He appreciated it until much later, when he came to understand that the precision he had admired was not an absence of concealment but a particular skill at making concealment look like clarity. They had married in year 5 of the company, at a venue in Springfield, 82 guests, simple food and a band that played 3 genres without committing to any of them. He had felt, on that day, the particular satisfaction of a man who has chosen correctly and knows it, which is a feeling that, in retrospect, tends to precede the discovery that the choosing was done with incomplete information. There was no prenuptial agreement. His attorney at the time, a man named Kettner who had handled the SBA documents and the facility's lease-to-own conversion, had raised the subject at the pre-marriage legal review Calvin had requested on general principle. Calvin had declined. He had used the same reasoning he always applied to decisions he later regretted. It felt like the wrong signal to send to someone who had just agreed to build a life with him. Kettner retired in year 11. His replacement was a younger attorney named Vasquez who had joined the same practice and inherited Calvin's file, and who ran his quarterly check-in calls with the slightly formal efficiency of a man who had been handed a client relationship he had not had the years to build from scratch. Calvin found him technically reliable, which was what he needed. Sheila had, in the early years, attended the annual company picnic and the holiday party and the occasional dinner with a significant client, and had asked intelligent questions about the aerospace contracts and the equipment build-out, and had never been in the way and never overstepped. She had her own career, her own accounts, her own professional calendar. They had operated in parallel, which Calvin had understood as a functional marriage between 2 people who each had a full set of responsibilities, and which he later understood was a parallel that had become a divergence and then a competing interest without any single visible transition. He had not seen the transition. He had been looking at the floor. He had a daughter, Rena, who was 12 now, and who was the person in Calvin's life who most resembled Douglas. The same squared shoulders, the same habit of looking at a problem from 3 feet back before engaging it, the same preference for doing a thing correctly over doing it quickly. She was in 7th grade and had recently decided that she wanted to study materials science, which had required some explanation to her teachers about what materials science was and why a 7th grader had opinions about it. Calvin had been quietly proud in a way that he expressed by buying her a book about metallurgy that she read cover to cover in 11 days. He and Sheila had been drifting for longer than Calvin had been willing to name. The word drifting was itself a form of not naming, a way of describing the incremental accumulation of distance between 2 people without requiring either party to identify the engine of the distance. He had been aware that the engine existed. He had chosen not to look at it directly, the way a man who is running a night shift on a deadline makes the choice not to look at the noise that is probably fine. The noise had not been fine. In the 14 months before the ownership transfer document landed on his desk, Sheila had attended 4 industry events that Calvin had not attended, had made 3 weekend trips to Chicago that she had described as client development, had spent an increasing number of evenings on her phone in the study with the door not quite closed, and had asked Calvin, twice, the kind of questions about the company's legal structure that a banker asks when they are thinking about something specific. He had answered them honestly because she was his wife and because he had no reason, at the time, to understand what she was building with the answers. He had a paperback on the nightstand, a novel about the construction of the Hoover Dam, that he had been reading for 8 weeks and was on page 78 of. Most nights he read 3 pages and fell asleep on the 4th. The bookmark had not moved significantly in the last month. He was not focused. He was in the state of a man who has a process running in the background of his operational mind that is consuming resources he needs elsewhere but that he has not yet identified or shut down. He had been in that state on the Tuesday morning when Breckenridge put the document on his desk. He sat alone in the front office for 8 minutes after Breckenridge closed the door. He read the ownership transfer document 3 times. It transferred 100% of the membership interest in Pruitt Industrial Fabrication LLC to an entity called Cordell Asset Acquisitions LLC. It bore a notarization stamp from a notary in Springfield whose license number Calvin wrote in his notebook without comment. It was dated the previous Friday. It listed Calvin's full legal name, his member ID from the original operating agreement, and the registered address of the facility. The only thing wrong with it, for someone who did not know Calvin Pruitt's signature from the inside, was the loop on the P. He picked up his phone and called Vasquez. He said, "I need you in my office this morning. Bring anyone you trust." Vasquez arrived at 10:45 with a paralegal named Okafor who specialized in document forensics. Vasquez read the transfer document and asked 2 questions. Then he called a contact at the State Commercial Registry and spent 14 minutes on hold and another 6 minutes in conversation. He hung up and said, "The transfer was filed on Friday afternoon. The registry shows Cordell Asset Acquisitions as the current member of record." Calvin said, "How is that possible without my actual signature?" Vasquez said, "It's not possible legally. What it is done. The question is how fast we move." Okafor had been examining the signature under a magnifying glass from her bag. She said, "This was done by someone who has spent time with your actual signature. The letter form is accurate to the point of being studied. The loop error is the kind of thing that appears when someone is copying rather than signing naturally." Calvin said, "Who is Cordell Asset Acquisitions?" Vasquez had already pulled the registration. The registered agent for Cordell Asset Acquisitions LLC was an entity management company in Delaware. The managing member listed in the public filings was a man named Darren Lyle. Calvin did not know that name. He wrote it in his notebook. He said, "Give me until end of day. Don't file anything yet." He called Rena's school and left a message that he might be late for pickup, which was the first time he had done that in 3 years, and then he went to the break room and poured a cup from the office machine, the one with the epoxy carafe, and stood at the window that looked out onto the shop floor and watched the day shift running at full capacity. Station 7 was cutting a titanium profile for one of the aerospace accounts, the machine running clean and steady, the chips falling correctly. Hector had that station dialed in the way a man gets a machine dialed in after 9 years. Not mechanically but intuitively, making adjustments before the readout tells you they are needed. Calvin watched for 2 minutes. Then he drove to the gas station and bought a coffee from Yvonne and sat in the truck in the parking lot with the coffee and the notebook and worked through what he knew and what he did not know in the sequential order that his father had called reading the floor. Reading the floor was what Douglas called the practice of walking a production floor and understanding its actual state from physical observation rather than from what anyone told you. You looked at the tooling condition, the material flow, the body language of the operators, the cleanliness of the machines. You read the floor and the floor told you things the supervisor's report never would. Calvin had been reading floors since he was 9 years old. He read this floor now. Someone had filed a forged ownership transfer on his company. The transfer named an entity he had never heard of, managed by a man he did not know. His wife had been asking questions about the company's legal structure. She had made 3 weekend trips to Chicago. She had attended 4 industry events without him. He pulled up the public registry for Cordell Asset Acquisitions on his phone. The registration address was a suite in a Chicago office building. He cross-referenced the suite number against a commercial directory. The suite belonged to a business consulting firm called Lyle Group Partners. He searched Darren Lyle. The results returned a LinkedIn profile, a Chicago Business Press mention from 3 years ago about a regional industrial acquisition, and a photograph from an industry event in which a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s was shaking hands with a local alderman. He had the kind of face that looked comfortable in photographs at industry events. He also had, in the background of one of the photographs, a woman in a green blazer who was standing at an angle that suggested she was in his group rather than passing through the frame. It was Sheila. The photograph was from an industry reception in Chicago. 14 months ago, Calvin sat in the gas station parking lot for 4 more minutes. He did not call Sheila. He did not drive to the facility. He put the truck in gear and drove to the office of his old accountant, Bernard, who had been doing Pruitt Industrials books for 9 years and who Calvin trusted with the kind of information that could not go through a paralegal. Bernard heard the summary and asked one question: does she have a legitimate claim on the LLC's assets in a divorce proceeding? Calvin said, "That's what I need to know." Bernard pulled up the company's operating agreement on his screen. He read for 6 minutes. He said, "The LLC was formed before the marriage. You are the sole member. She signed no instruments as a co-member. The business income went into the business operating account and your personal draw went into the marital account." He looked up. "The LLC is your separate property. She's got no ownership claim. The transfer, if it holds, doesn't give her anything. It gives Lyle's entity the company." Calvin said, "She's not trying to own it. She's trying to hand it to him." Bernard said, "Why would she do that?" Calvin said, "That's the next thing I need to find out." He called Vasquez from the parking lot of Bernard's office. He said, "I need you to research whether a forged transfer of LLC membership interest constitutes criminal fraud in Illinois or only civil. I also need you to find out everything you can about Darren Lyle and Cordell Asset Acquisitions without triggering any response from their side. And I need to know our options for protecting the LLC before they try to take physical possession." Vasquez said, "If they have a filed transfer and they believe it's valid, they may attempt to assert operational control." Calvin said, "When?" Vasquez said, "If I were advising them, I'd say give it 10 days to see if you notice and react. If you don't react, they might assume the transfer went through without resistance." Calvin said, "Then I have 10 days. He used 8 of them. The research on Darren Lyle arrived in layers over 4 days, assembled by Vasquez's office and by a private investigator named Collier that Vasquez had used on 3 prior matters and described as expensive and thorough, which was the combination Calvin required. Calvin continued running the facility during those 4 days. He arrived at 7 each morning and worked the production floor until 9, reviewing the overnight shift report, walking the stations, signing off on the material requisitions. He attended a vendor call on day 2 about raw stock pricing that he had been rescheduling for 3 weeks. He spoke to each of his 4 department leads in their normal daily rhythm and gave no signal that anything in the world outside the production schedule had changed. The cost of visible panic in a manufacturing environment was a production shutdown, which was something Douglas had told him in the Springfield shop when Calvin was 11 and a hydraulic line had burst on the press brake and 2 operators had looked at Douglas to see what kind of emergency this was. Douglas had walked over, turned off the machine, said, "Get the shop vac and a drain pan," and gone back to what he had been doing. Calvin had watched that response and understood something important about the relationship between composure and authority. He kept his face correct. He did his job. He read the research when it came in. The first layer, Darren Lyle had been acquiring small and mid-sized industrial facilities in the Midwest for 11 years. Not growing them, acquiring them, stripping their equipment and tooling through liquidation or private sale, and closing the facilities. 8 documented acquisitions in Illinois and Indiana over the 11-year period. 4 of the facilities were now empty buildings. 2 were occupied by unrelated tenants. 2 had been demolished. In none of the 8 cases had the workforce been retained beyond 60 days post-acquisition. The second layer, Lyle's acquisition method had a pattern. He identified facilities with a single owner-operator, a clear asset base in equipment, and a legal structure that could be reached through the ownership instrument. He did not buy companies. He acquired the ownership instrument and then liquidated what the instrument controlled. He was not in the business of industrial operations. He was in the business of equipment arbitrage. The third layer was Collier's work, and it was the one that connected the private picture to the professional one. Collier had pulled Sheila's cell carrier records through a process he described only as appropriate and which Calvin did not ask him to elaborate on, and had cross-referenced the location data with the dates of her Chicago trips and the industry events. Sheila had been in contact with Darren Lyle's registered cell number for 22 months. The earliest contact predated the first Chicago trip by 4 months. 22 months. Rena had been 10 years old. Calvin wrote that on the notebook. He did not add anything below it. He sat with it for the length of time it took his coffee to go cold, which was 11 minutes, and then he closed the notebook and called Vasquez. He said, 22 months. Vasquez said, I know. Calvin said, she gave him the structural information he needed. He designed the transfer around it. Vasquez said, that's what the document suggests. The LLC member ID in the transfer agreement is not publicly available. It comes from the operating agreement. She had access to it. Calvin said, what does she get? There was a pause. Vasquez said, Collier found a wire transfer record. 12 months ago, a payment of $240,000 went from a Cordell Asset Acquisitions subsidiary account to a personal account held by Sheila under a maiden name variation she registered as a DBA 3 years ago. $240,000. 12 months ago. She had received the payment a year before the transfer was filed, which meant she had been paid for the information and the access and the eventual execution of the forgery before the forgery existed. She had been paid in advance. It was not a betrayal made in the heat of a deteriorating marriage. It was a transaction. Calvin looked at the notebook. He said, I need to know what Lyle plans to do with the facility. Vasquez said, based on the 8 prior acquisitions. Calvin said, he's going to strip it. Vasquez said, that's what the pattern suggests. Equipment of the type you run, CNC machining centers, laser cutting systems, overhead cranes, that inventory moves quickly in the secondary market. He'd have buyers for most of it within 60 days of taking possession. Calvin said, how long would the machines take to move? Vasquez said, with the right logistics team, a facility like yours could be emptied in 10 to 14 days. Calvin said, I need you to get me in front of a bankruptcy attorney today. Vasquez said, today. Calvin said, before end of business. He drove to the facility at noon and parked in his usual spot and went inside. He walked the floor for 40 minutes. He walked it the way he had walked it the first time, the day after the construction crews handed it over, when the building was empty and clean and still smelled of new concrete, and he had stood in the center of the floor and imagined what he was going to put in it. He walked it now the way he walked it that day, not with the operational eye of a man managing production, but with the structural eye of a man reading something before he has to change it. 16 CNC machining centers. He knew the serial number of each one without looking. He knew which ones had been rebuilt and when. He knew the tooling condition on every spindle because he had personally inspected 8 of them in the last month as part of a preventive maintenance audit. He knew the laser cutting system the way a surgeon knows a tool they have used for 10 years, the particular sound of the motion system when the head is moving at maximum traverse, the way the assist gas smelled when the nozzle was slightly off-center, the correction he made by feel before the diagnostic caught it. He stood in the middle of the floor for 4 minutes and said nothing to anyone. He was reading the floor. He was reading it as an asset, calculating what it was worth to the right buyer, which was a different number from what it was worth to Darren Lyle, because Lyle would price it for quick liquidation and the right buyer would price it for what it could produce. He also knew that the right buyer was not the point right now. The point was that these machines, this equipment, these 41 people were not going to be handed to a man who stripped industrial facilities the way other people stripped copper wire from empty houses. He walked back to the front office, told Breckenridge the afternoon production plan looked solid, and left to meet the bankruptcy attorney. The bankruptcy attorney's name was Farwell, and she operated from an office in Springfield, 25 miles from the facility. She had practiced Chapter 11 reorganization and Chapter 7 liquidation for 19 years, and she listened to the situation summary in the same way Bernard had listened, which was to say without interrupting and without adjusting her expression. When Calvin finished, she asked 4 questions, each one more specific than the last, and at the end of the 4th she said, what you're describing is a voluntary Chapter 7 filing by the LLC member, meaning you. in which the member initiates liquidation of the business entity's assets prior to any adverse party taking possession. Calvin said, "Yes." Farwell said, "If the transfer instrument is fraudulent, which based on your description it is, then the true member of record is still you. A filing by the true member, supported by the forensic evidence of the forgery, would have standing. A Chapter 7 filing triggers an automatic stay." Calvin said, "Which means?" Farwell said, "Which means no party can take possession of the assets or exercise ownership rights without court authorization. The moment the filing is accepted, Lyle's ability to walk into your facility and remove your equipment is legally blocked." She paused. "But the filing also initiates liquidation. The trustee controls the asset disposition. You would not recover the business as a going concern." Calvin said, "I know." He said it without hesitation. Farwell looked at him for a moment. She said, "You've already decided." He said, "He was going to strip it anyway." "I'm deciding who controls the stripping." She said, "Filing within the next 72 hours gives you the strongest position. The forgery complaint to the state attorney general can run parallel. The notary whose stamp is on that document needs to be in the filing." Calvin said, "I have the license number." Farwell said, "Give it to me and I'll have someone pull his disciplinary record tonight." The notary's name was Taryn Goss. He had been licensed in Illinois for 6 years. Farwell's office found, by 9 o'clock that evening, that Goss had 2 prior complaints on file with the State Notary Regulatory Board, one for improper acknowledgement and one for failure to verify signer identity, both resolved with informal reprimands. A third complaint, formal this time, was filed the following morning by Farwell's office on Calvin's behalf, alleging that Goss had notarized a forged instrument in knowing assistance of a fraudulent ownership transfer. The complaint was accompanied by the forensic analysis from Vasquez's paralegal, the document itself, and a sworn statement from Calvin. The Illinois Attorney General's Commercial Fraud Unit received a parallel referral from Vasquez the same afternoon. Before any of that moved through the institutional pipeline, Calvin had done something that required more than legal preparation. He had told Rena. He had picked her up from school on a Thursday, 2 days after the document landed on his desk, and they had driven to a diner they had been going to since she was 4, a place on El Dorado Street where the booths were vinyl and the coffee was mediocre, and Rena always ordered the same grilled cheese and tomato soup combination she had ordered since the first visit. He had told her, in the straightforward language he had always used with her, that something serious was happening with the business and that it involved her mother and that he wanted her to hear it from him before she heard it anywhere else. She had listened without speaking until he finished. She had a habit of pulling at the cuff of her sleeve when she was processing something significant, which she had been doing since she was 6 and which she was doing now. She said, "Did she know what he was going to do to the building?" Calvin said, "I believe so." Rena said, "All those people work there." Calvin said, "I know." She said, "What happens to them?" He said, "I'm working on that. I can't promise anything yet, but I'm working on it." He paused. "I wanted you to know that I did not stand still. I'm not going to stand still." She looked at him with the squared shoulders expression that was Douglas's expression on Douglas's face 50 years ago. She said, "I want to be there when it's over." He said, "I'll tell you everything when it's over." She said, "That's not the same thing." He said, "I know, but it's what I can offer right now." She pulled at her cuff. Then she said, "Okay," and she ate her grilled cheese, and they drove home in the silence of 2 people who have agreed on something and do not need to add words to the agreement. Collier found the second knife on day 6. It was not a romantic partner of Sheila's, not a sibling with a guilty conscience. It was Calvin's general manager, a man named Weston who had been running the facility's day-to-day operations for 4 years, who had Calvin's complete operational trust, and who had, according to the records Collier assembled from a combination of public business filings and cell location data, met with Darren Lyle's associate 3 times over the past 8 months. The meetings had taken place at a hotel bar in Springfield, a location 20 miles from the facility, which was far enough to feel private. Weston had not forged anything. He had not transferred anything. What he had done was provide, over 3 meetings, accurate operational data about the facility's equipment inventory, maintenance records, and estimated replacement values. The kind of information a buyer would need to price a liquidation. The kind of information that would have been useful to Lyle long before the transfer was ever filed. Collier had the cell location records and a photograph from a hotel parking lot camera, obtained through the hotel's loss prevention department on the representation that it related to a pending fraud investigation, which it did. Calvin drove to the facility on day 6, arriving at 4 in the afternoon when the day shift was winding down. He walked the floor for 20 minutes the way he always walked the floor, stopping at each of the 16 CNC stations and looking at the tooling condition and the material staging and the cleanliness of the machine bases. He spoke to 3 operators by name and asked one of them, a man named Hector who had been running Station 7 for 9 years, how the new tooling on the aluminum profile work was performing. Hector said it was running clean. Calvin said good and moved on. He found Weston in the production office at 4:45. He closed the door. He put Collier's photograph on the desk, the parking lot image, and said nothing. He watched Weston look at it. Weston did not say he had never seen that man before. He did not say he had no idea what that was. He looked at it for 3 seconds with the expression of a man who has been expecting a door to open and has just heard the handle turn. He said, "She told me it was a buyout, a voluntary one. She said you had agreed and you were handling the transition." Calvin said, "She told you I had agreed." Weston said, "She said it was settled. She said the paperwork was being prepared." Calvin said, "And you gave them the equipment values." Weston said, "I thought I was preparing the company for a transition you had decided on." Calvin looked at him for a long time. A man who had worked in his facility for 4 years. A man who had eaten at the company holiday dinner. A man whose daughter's graduation Calvin had attended 3 months ago and whose hand he had shaken in the parking lot of the school with genuine warmth. He said, "I believe you thought it was legitimate. I also know that the protocol when a business owner's spouse tells you the owner has agreed to sell the company is to confirm it with the owner." He said it without heat. "You didn't do that." Weston said, "No." Calvin said, "I need you to write down everything she told you when she told you and what you provided to Lyle's people. Everything. In your own words tonight." He picked up the photograph. "Give it to Vasquez in the morning. It's going to be part of the Attorney General's file." He opened the door. "Your separation package is 2 months. Vasquez will have the paperwork by Friday." Weston said, "Calvin." Calvin said, "The people on the floor didn't know anything. You did. That's the difference." He walked back out to the shop floor and stood for a moment at the bay door, looking at the building. The 4 overhead cranes. The CNC stations. The laser cutter running on a night shift job. The building breathed its low metallic settle in the cold November air. He had heard that sound for 14 years. He drove home and made dinner and checked Rena's homework and did not say anything about Weston because there was nothing to say that the morning wouldn't clarify on its own. Farwell filed the Chapter 7 petition for Pruitt Industrial Fabrication LLC on day 8, bearing Calvin's signature, which looked nothing like the one on the fraudulent transfer because Calvin's loop leaned right and always had. The filing triggered the automatic stay. The bankruptcy trustee, a woman named Delacroix who Farwell had worked with on 2 prior cases and described as fair and rigorous, accepted the petition and began the asset inventory process. The inventory revealed what Calvin already knew: 16 CNC machining centers, appraised at a combined secondary market value of $1.9 million. The laser cutting system, $430,000. The 4 overhead cranes, $280,000. Tooling, fixtures, raw material inventory, and ancillary equipment, approximately $600,000 additional. Total liquidation value of the equipment, $3.2 million. The building itself was under a lease-to-own agreement with a commercial property holding company, with 11 years remaining on the term. The lease was an asset of the LLC. It was included in the bankruptcy estate. Calvin had called the equipment dealer he had worked with on the CNC build-out, a man named Armand who operated a regional secondary market brokerage, and had informed him, under the trustee's authorization, that the equipment was available for placement. Armand had buyers for 8 of the 16 machining centers within 4 days of the inventory being filed. The laser system went in 6. The cranes took 12. By the time 30 days had passed from the petition filing, the building on the outer edge of Decatur was empty. The overhead cranes were gone. The CNC stations were gone. The laser cutting system was on a flatbed in Tennessee. The building breathed differently without the equipment. It did not settle the same way. The low metallic sound was gone. It was just a building now. Darren Lyle had attempted to assert operational authority over the facility on day 11, which was 3 days after the stay was filed. His attorney sent a letter to Vasquez asserting that the transfer was valid and that Cordell Asset Acquisitions was the rightful member of record and requested immediate access to the premises for an operational assessment. Vasquez forwarded the letter to Farwell, who responded with the stay filing and the bankruptcy court case number, and a note indicating that any contact regarding the assets of the estate should be directed to Trustee Delacroix. Lyle's attorney did not respond to that letter for 9 days, which told Vasquez something about the quality of the advice Lyle was receiving. Lyle appeared in person at the facility on day 19. He came with 2 men who had the posture of people who move things for a living and a truck with a logo on the side suggesting equipment transport, the kind of truck you bring when you plan to leave with something. The facility manager, a holdover from the day shift crew who had agreed to stay on through the bankruptcy process for a modest stipend, met them at the gate on a Thursday morning. He had Farwell's contact number in his pocket and Trustee Delacroix's case documents on a clipboard, and he had been told exactly what to say and nothing else. He told Lyle that the facility was under the jurisdiction of a federal bankruptcy trustee and that no party had authorization to remove, inspect, or inventory any asset without written authorization from the trustee. He handed Lyle a copy of the stay filing and the case number. He said Trustee Delacroix's contact information was on the second page if Mr. Lyle had questions. Lyle looked at the clipboard. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, and he had the posture of a man who expected situations to resolve in his favor, and the posture was not resolving cleanly. He looked at the building. He looked at the truck he had brought. He said, "Where is the equipment?" The manager said, "That's a question for Trustee Delacroix, sir." Lyle walked past him to the bay doors. He looked through the window in the roll-up panel. The floor was clean and swept and empty. The 16 CNC stations were gone. The footprint anchors were still in the concrete where they had been bolted, 16 sets of clean steel plates in the floor, but the machines themselves were gone. The crane rails ran the length of the ceiling, but the cranes were gone. The laser cutter pad was empty. The tooling racks along the east wall were bare. The overhead lighting was on because the building was still under utility service, and it lit an empty floor the way stage lighting illuminates a set between performances. Lyle stood at the window for a long time. The facility manager stood behind him with the clipboard and said nothing. Lyle walked the perimeter to the second bay door and looked through that window as well. Same floor, same emptiness, same anchor plates in the concrete. He walked back to the truck. The 2 men who had come with him to move things were standing by the cab looking at the sky and at each other and at the building in the way people look at a situation they had not been briefed on. The truck with the equipment transport logo had come a long way for an empty building. Lyle said something to them that the facility manager was not close enough to hear. Then the truck left. The second victim in this story was a man named Dex Okafor who had been approached by Lyle's people 3 months before the transfer was filed about purchasing a partial stake in a facility they described as a strong acquisition candidate with existing aerospace contracts and a solid equipment base. Dex ran a precision components operation in Indiana and had been looking to expand his capacity. He had put $500,000 into an escrow account designated for the transaction. He had not yet completed due diligence. His money was in escrow when the bankruptcy stay was filed. Vasquez had found Dex through the escrow documentation that Collier had pulled from Lyle's entity filings. Calvin had called Dex's attorney directly, identified himself as the actual owner of the facility, and explained the situation. Dex's attorney had retrieved the escrow funds within 24 hours, before any court order required it, because the escrow had been structured with a due diligence contingency that applied once the material facts of the transaction changed. The material facts had changed significantly. Calvin met Dex by phone for 30 minutes. Dex said two things worth remembering. He said first, I looked at the facility on paper and it was exactly what they said it was. He said second, I'm glad I hadn't moved the money out of escrow. Calvin said he understood both of those things. He said he was sorry Dex had been put in the position and that the situation was not a reflection of how Calvin operated. Dex said he could tell. The call ended cordially. The Attorney General's complaint against the notary, Goss, resulted in an emergency suspension of his license within 30 days of filing. The criminal referral to the Commercial Fraud Unit was accepted by the AG's office and assigned to an investigator. Sheila was contacted by that investigator in early December. She retained a criminal defense attorney that same week. Calvin did not know and did not seek to know the specifics of those conversations because they belonged to a process that was no longer his to manage. He had handed it to the institutions that handled such things and had returned to his responsibilities. The 41 employees were the thing Calvin had told Rena he was working on. He had been working on it. In the 2 weeks between the petition filing and the equipment liquidation, Calvin had made 12 phone calls. He had called every major industrial operator in the central Illinois corridor who had ever sent him a referral, a subcontract, or a note of professional regard, and had told each of them plainly what was happening and that he had 41 experienced fabrication workers who were going to be available and who were the best in the region and who had built an aerospace-grade operation from scratch. He did not ask for favors. He provided resumes and certifications. He offered to vouch for every one of them personally. 3 of the 12 calls resulted in facility tours scheduled within the week, which was faster than he had expected and which told him that the reputation of the Pruitt industrial workforce had traveled further than he had known. He assembled the full team for a meeting on a Thursday afternoon, and all hands in the main bay, standing in front of the CNC stations that were already tagged for the first equipment sale. He told them everything. He told them the company had been the subject of a forged ownership transfer. He told them the transfer was fraudulent and that he had taken the legal steps available to him to protect what could be protected, which meant protecting them before it meant protecting the business entity. He told them the machines were going to be sold as part of the bankruptcy liquidation, but that he had already begun conversations with regional operators who were hiring and that he was personally committed to placing every one of them who wanted a placement. The bay was quiet for a moment after he stopped talking. Then Breckenridge, who had been with the company since year 2 and who had never been a man of many words, said, "You came back and told us yourself." That was the full comment. Several people nodded. Calvin said yes, and that was the full reply, and the meeting ended and people went back to finishing the shift. By the end of the month, 33 of the 41 had been placed. 4 more were placed in the following 6 weeks. The remaining 4 were older workers within 2 years of retirement who took their severance and the early departure as the end they had been moving toward, which was a choice Calvin respected and told each of them so directly and shook each hand and meant every handshake. Hector, from Station 7, was hired by a precision machining facility in Peoria that had been trying to recruit him for 2 years. Calvin knew because the facility manager had called him years ago, asking whether Hector might be available, and Calvin had said no without guilt because Hector was exactly where he was supposed to be. Now Hector was available and the call had been the easiest of the 12. Hector called Calvin the week after his start date to say thank you. Calvin said the thanks belonged to Hector for 14 years of running Station 7 the way it deserved to be run. He meant it and Hector knew he meant it, and the call was short because neither of them required more than that. The bankruptcy estate closed 7 months after the petition. The net proceeds from the equipment liquidation after trustee fees, legal costs, and a modest priority claim from the SBA on the residual of the original construction loan returned $1.8 million to Calvin as the sole equity holder of the dissolved entity. The transfer instrument filed by Cordell Asset Acquisitions had been formally invalidated by the bankruptcy court as a fraudulent encumbrance on the estate. Lyle's entity received nothing from the bankruptcy proceeding. The $500,000 earnest deposit Lyle had put down as part of the acquisition process was the subject of a separate civil action that his escrow arrangement had not protected as effectively as Dex Okafor's had. Sheila's criminal exposure had not been resolved as of the estate's closure. The investigation was ongoing. Calvin did not follow it closely. He had a different set of things to follow. He had used part of the proceeds to pay off the house fully, which removed the second mortgage he had taken for the original construction loan and which gave him, For the first time in 14 years, a clear title to the three-bedroom house in Decatur where Rena's bedroom still had her metallurgy book on the shelf and where the maple tree in the front yard had dropped its leaves and was standing bare and uncomplicated in the December cold. He had not opened a new company yet. He had consulted with Bernard and with Vasquez and with Farwell about the mechanics of it, about what form a new entity would take and what protections it would carry from the beginning. Farwell had said, with the directness of someone who knew her client, "Make sure the next operating agreement has a buy-sell provision that no spouse can touch." He had said he planned to. She had said, "Kettner should have told you that 14 years ago." He said, "Kettner did." She said, "Then you should have listened." He said, "Yes." He meant it. He read the Hoover Dam book during the 30 days of the bankruptcy process, carrying it to the meetings with Farwell and reading in the waiting room before each appointment, advancing through it steadily now that the thing running in the background of his mind had a direction and a shape and was no longer consuming the processing power he used for reading. He finished it on a Wednesday evening in the third week, sitting in the kitchen after Rena had gone to bed, the last 40 pages in one sitting. He set it down and held it for a moment and thought about the construction of something large and permanent in difficult conditions, which was what the book was about on one level and what 14 years of Pruitt Industrial had been on another. He drove to the facility on the last day of the estate process, after the trustee had issued the final closing notice. The building was still standing, would continue standing, the commercial property holder's lease obligation having been extinguished by the bankruptcy with 9 months of termination compensation that covered the balance of Calvin's obligations. The building was someone else's problem now, or someone else's opportunity, depending on what they did with it. He parked the truck and got out and stood in the parking lot. The building did not settle the way it used to. It was quiet in the way a building is quiet when it has been emptied of its life. He stood there for 4 minutes and thought about Douglas, about the Springfield parking lot and the thermos and the cardiac event and the 90 days that followed, and about the yellow legal pad list and everything that had come from it. He got back in the truck. He drove to the gas station on the way back. Yvonne was behind the counter. She had his order ready before he reached the register. He paid and said thank you and used her name. He drove home. Rena was at the kitchen table with the metallurgy book open and a notebook beside it, working through something she had underlined and wanted to understand more completely. She looked up when he came in. She said, "Is it done?" He said, "The legal part is done." She said, "What comes next?" He said, "I'm going to build something new, different structure, better protected." He sat down across from her. "When you're old enough, if you want in, there's going to be something to be in." She looked at him the way she looked at problems she had already begun solving. She said, "I know what I want to study." He said, "I know." She said, "Material science is about understanding what things are made of so you know how much pressure they can take before they change shape." He said, "I know." She said, "You built something that couldn't be taken because you understood what it was made of." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked the way you said that." She went back to the metallurgy book. He got up and made coffee from the same dark roast in the machine with the epoxy-repaired carafe, because the epoxy still held and a thing that worked did not need to be replaced. He picked up the Hoover Dam novel from the counter, where it had been sitting with the bookmark on page 78 for 2 months, and he sat at the kitchen table across from his daughter and read 24 pages before she closed her notebook and said good night. He read 6 more after she went upstairs. Then he put the book down and looked at the kitchen and thought that what Sheila had tried to take was the company, and what she had not understood was that the company was the output, not the source. The source was the knowledge of how to build it. The source was Douglas's hands and the sound of the building breathing and the 14 years of reading floors that told you, before anyone else noticed, where the load was actually traveling. Darren Lyle had walked into an empty building and stood at the window of a bay door looking for something that was already gone. He had bought a deed to a shell. He had purchased, at considerable expense, the precise legal form of a thing without any of its substance. And the man who had built the substance had already moved it to where it needed to be, 3 states away, in the hands of 41 people who knew what to do with it. You cannot acquire what a man knows by taking the building where he learned it. Darren Lyle was still learning that. Thank you for staying with this one all the way through. If it got to you, hit subscribe and leave a like so you are here for the next one. I have two more stories ready, and I think you are going to want to hear them both.